Dear listeners, welcome to Sleeping Historian.
Imagine waking up in a world without electricity, without running water, without even the smallest comforts we take for granted today. The year is somewhere in the 1500s, and you're in Tudor, Britain. The streets are muddy, the air is thick with smoke, and life itself feels fragile, always threatened by famine, fire, or disease. For many of us, Tudor England is a time of kings and queens, glittering courts, and dramatic history. But the truth is far darker, far harder, and far more uncomfortable than the romantic images we often imagine. In this story, we will walk together through a single day in Tudor Britain. From the moment you wake up in a straw bed crawling with lice, to the food you are forced to eat, the work you must endure, the filth you cannot escape, and the dangers that lurk around every corner, you will soon realize that you would not survive very long at all. Even the nobles, with all their fine clothes and feasts, lived under constant fear, whether of sickness, betrayal, or the sharp turn of royal favor. So, settle in, let your mind drift back to another age, and prepare to experience the daily life of Tudor Britain. What seems like a single day in their world will reveal why most of us would never make it. Just for a moment, that you have fallen asleep not in your comfortable modern bed with clean sheets and quiet air, but in a house in Tudor England sometime around the year 1550. The night has passed slowly, not because you were restless, but because the conditions around you are so utterly foreign to the way you live today. Instead of a firm mattress and a pillow shaped to your liking, you're lying on what is known as a straw pallet. It is little more than a sack stuffed with straw or reeds, flattened by use, and never quite clean. Over time, the straw breaks down, collecting dust, dirt, and insects. Fleas and lice crawl through the fibers, and you might wake up scratching before the sun has even begun to rise. The smell is not pleasant either, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and dampness that clings to everything inside the house. Your blanket, if you have one, is rough wool, scratchy against the skin, and heavy with the chill of the night. Tudor houses were rarely warm in the way you imagine warmth. They were built of timber with wattle and daub walls, and the gaps in the construction let in drafts. If you were poor, which most people in Tudor England were, you would have only a single room to share with your family. The fire, left smoldering overnight, might have filled the space with smoke rather than heat. Chimneys were uncommon in smaller homes, so the smoke simply lingered indoors, creeping into the thatched roof, staining the walls black, and filling your lungs as you breathed. You cough as you rise, and your eyes sting before they adjust to the murky morning air. Before the town itself awakens, you hear the sounds of animals stirring. Chickens cluck outside the doorway, pigs grunt nearby, and perhaps a cow shifts restlessly in the small yard. The family likely keeps them close, both for protection and because animals were an essential part of daily life. Their smells mix with the already smoky, damp air of your room, reminding you of how close nature presses into human life in Tudor times. There is no separation, Your living quarters, your animals, and your labor are all bound together in a single space. You roll off the straw mattress and touch the cold earth floor beneath you. Carpets and rugs, if they exist at all in your household, are made of rushes or reeds scattered across the ground. These are changed only a few times a year, which means that bits of food, waste, and insects collect within them. Walking barefoot, you feel not the smoothness of wood or tile, but the uneven crunch of rushes beneath your toes. For wealthier households, there might be wooden planks or mats of woven wool. But for the majority of Tudor families, the floor is another place where dirt and life intermingle. If you were lucky enough to be born into a wealthier family, your waking experience will be somewhat different, though not necessarily more comfortable by modern standards. In a noble house, or even among the gentry, you might sleep in a tester bed, raised from the ground with carved wooden posts and draped in heavy curtains. These curtains serve both to block drafts and to create a small cocoon of warmth, but they also trap in the musty smells of human life. Your mattress might be stuffed with feathers rather than straw, but fleas and lice are not choosy about where they live. They infest the sheets, the seams of the mattress, and even the hair on your head. Combing and nitpicking are a daily task, and you never truly rid yourself. Dawn breaks through small, glassless windows covered in oiled cloth or wooden shutters. You begin to prepare yourself for the day. There is no luxury of sleeping in. Life in Tudor Britain is dictated by the sun. When the day begins, so must you, for every hour of daylight is precious. Artificial lighting is expensive and unreliable. Candles are made of tallow, which smokes and smells unpleasant, or of beeswax, which only the wealthy can afford. So, as the light slowly filters into your smoky room, you rise because it is the only time you have to work, to eat, and to live. You notice how cramped the living space is. In a single-room cottage, the entire family sleeps in the same area. Parents, children, and sometimes even servants share the same space. Privacy is a luxury unknown to most. The family bed might be shared by multiple people, and if you're a child, you might sleep on the floor, wrapped in a thin blanket. It is warm in the sense that human bodies generate heat together, but it is also noisy, crowded, and uncomfortable. The fire is little more than embers now, and before anything else, it must be stirred back to life. A spark, a few twigs, and the smoky hearth is rekindled, filling the room once more with haze. Without it, the house is unbearably cold. The smoke itself has left a mark on the entire structure of the house. The roof beams above are blackened, the walls stained dark. Long-term exposure to this air is damaging, but there is no escape. People grow accustomed to the smoky atmosphere, though many suffer from persistent coughs and breathing difficulties. It is part of Tudor life, as natural to them as clean air, of the outside world growing louder. The street, if you live in a town, begins to stir with activity. Vendors preparing for market, neighbors calling out, and the occasional clatter of a cart on cobblestones. If you are in the countryside, the crows caw, the animals shuffle, and the distant sound of labor begins. There is no alarm clock to pull you from your rest. The world itself announces the new day. Waking up in Tudor Britain is less a moment of refreshment and more a confrontation with reality. The body is stiff from the straw bed, the eyes irritated from the smoke, and the stomach already hinting at hunger. You are not beginning your day with a hot shower, fresh coffee, and the gentle hum of modern conveniences. Instead, you wake into a world where survival is the first priority and every task, from lighting the fire to fetching water, demands immediate attention. So, as you open your eyes fully and sit up in that dim, smoky Tudor room, you realize that surviving even this first moment of the day already feels like a challenge. And yet, this is only the beginning. The hardships that follow, the food, the work, the dangers of illness and superstition, will remind you again and again why, if you truly found yourself transported into Tudor Britain, you likely would not last the first week light of morning struggles through the smoky haze of your Tudor home. You rise from the straw mattress and feel the chill of the earth floor beneath your feet. Your stomach already gives a faint groan of hunger. But breakfast, as you know it today, hot coffee, toast, eggs, perhaps fruit or porridge, is not waiting for you in Tudor England. What you are about to eat, if you are lucky enough to eat at all, is meager, rough, and often unpleasant. The Tudor breakfast is not a meal of indulgence. It is fuel, simple, repetitive, and sometimes barely enough to stave off the pangs of hunger. For the poorest families, breakfast might be nothing more than a hunk of coarse bread, dark and heavy with grains like rye or barley. Wheat, the grain that makes the soft white bread of modern tables, was too expensive for most. Your bread is hard, sometimes baked with additives like chalk, alum, or even ground up beans to stretch the flour. It might be days old, tough to chew, and stale on the tongue. Bread was the cornerstone of the Tudor diet, eaten with nearly every meal, but it carried risks too. Bad harvests led to moldy flour and illnesses like ergot, a fungus that infects rye, could slip into the dough. Eating such bread could make you dizzy, sick, or worse. Yet bread is essential, so you eat without complaint because there is nothing else. There is a kind of thick, porridge-like dish called pottage, made from whatever vegetables are available: onions, peas, leeks, or beans, boiled together in a cauldron. Pottage is the ever-present meal of Tudor peasants. For breakfast, a small bowl might be ladled out, still cold from the night before, since reheating requires fuel you cannot spare. The taste is earthy, bland, and repetitive, but it fills your stomach. The same pot of pottage might bubble on the hearth all day, with new scraps of food tossed in when available. Sometimes it contains bits of fish or a rare piece of meat, but more often it is simply vegetables, herbs, and water thickened into a mush. Instead of water, you drink ale. Not the strong, intoxicating ale of a tavern, but small beer, a weak, watery brew with little alcohol. Water in Tudor towns and villages was unsafe, tainted by waste, seeping from cesspits, and running through streets filled with refuse. To drink it raw was to risk illness. Brewing ale, even weak ale, killed off some of the harmful elements and made it safer. Everyone drank it, from children to the elderly. So with your bread and pottage, you sip a cup of ale, slightly sour, warm, and far from refreshing, but reliable in a world where clean water to a wealthier household, breakfast looks only a little better. Nobles and gentry were not known for large breakfasts. In fact, many believed that eating too much in the morning was a sign of weakness or gluttony. A Tudor noble might instead break their fast with spiced bread, cheese, or perhaps some eggs. In larger houses, the bread might be white, the prized manchet loaf, soft, fine, and carefully sifted of impurities. To eat white bread was to announce your status, for it cost far more than the coarse brown loaves of commoners. With this might come butter, honey, or ale of higher quality. Occasionally, a wealthy Tudor might begin the day with meat, such as bacon, though this was considered unusual except among the gentry or those preparing for travel. Still, even in the richest halls, breakfast remained a modest meal compared to dinner, which was the centerpiece of the Tudor day. Breakfast was functional, something to carry you until midday, not a feast to linger over. It lacked the ritual and abundance we associate with the first meal of modern life. Imagine sitting at a long wooden table, the air still smoky from the hearth, eating your bread and sipping ale in silence, preparing yourself for a day of labor or intrigue, depending on your station. There is no coffee to wake you, no tea. Those luxuries are centuries away. What you eat is heavy, plain, and slow to digest, but it is all your body will have for hours. Hunger was a constant companion. In years of bad harvests, when wheat failed or barley rotted in the fields, breakfast became even more pitiful. Some families had little more than bread stretched thinly across a household of many mouths. Others ate nothing at all until midday, when the first chance of food came after hours of work. To wake with an empty stomach and labor until noon was common, and those moments of hunger gnawed at both body and spirit. Malnutrition was widespread, and though pottage and bread could keep people alive, they did not always keep them strong. The danger of food poisoning also lingered with every bite. Preservation methods were limited, and meat was often salted or spiced to disguise the fact that it had spoiled. Milk soured quickly without refrigeration, and butter turned rancid in the heat. Even bread, so central to Tudor life, could be adulterated with ground bones, sand, or even lime by dishonest bakers hoping to stretch their flour supply. These additions damaged teeth, weakened bodies, and sometimes even poisoned those who relied on bread daily. So each mouthful of your Tudor breakfast is a gamble. You hope it sustains you without making you ill. Breakfast also reflects the deep divide between rich and poor. For nobles, even a small meal might include imported spices, honey, and soft cheese. For the poor, it was a monotonous cycle of bread, ale, and pottage. Yet both classes shared one truth. Variety was scarce, and luxury was reserved for the rarest occasions. The idea of a balanced breakfast with fruits, grains, and proteins is a modern invention. For Tudors, as you food was simply bread and sip your warm ale. You notice how different the rhythm of the day feels. There is no rush of caffeine, no sweetness of sugar, no fresh fruit to brighten the palate. Those things are luxuries of a later world. Instead, your body slowly awakens on fuel that feels heavy in your stomach, settling like a stone as you prepare for labor. This is not a breakfast that delights, but one that simply sustains. And as you rise from the table, wiping crumbs from your hands, you know you will not eat again until midday. The morning stretches long ahead of you, filled with toil, danger, and discomfort, and all you carry with you is the simple Tudor breakfast: bread, pottage, and ale. This small meal, so meager by modern standards, reminds you once again that a single day in Tudor Britain is no easy task. Even the very first bite of food tells you that survival here is less about comfort and more about bread and bitter ale. It is time to dress for the day. In Tudor Britain, clothing is not just fabric you wear. It is a symbol, a declaration of who you are, where you stand in society, and what rules you are forced to follow. But while clothes carry meaning, they also carry discomfort. The act of dressing is less about comfort and practicality, and more about survival, law, and appearance. What you put on each morning reminds you that life in Tudor England is governed not only by nature and hunger, but by a strict hierarchy stitched into every thread of your garments. For the poor, clothing is simple but far from comfortable. Imagine pulling on a shirt made of rough linen, coarse, scratchy, and stiff, sometimes never properly washed, always smelling faintly of smoke from the hearth. Your outer layer is wool, thick and heavy. Wool dominates Tudor clothing because it is cheap, warm, and readily available. But wool in this period is not the soft, refined textile you might imagine. It is scratchy, itchy, and heavy when damp. In winter, it keeps out some of the cold, though never enough. In summer, it traps heat and sweat against your skin. You tie it with cords or leather strips, since buttons are rare if you have them, are stiff and made of leather, shaped more like clumsy blocks than the flexible footwear you know today. For many of the poorest, shoes are worn until the soles nearly disintegrate, patched over and over again, or sometimes abandoned altogether. Walking barefoot through mud, refuse, and filth is not uncommon. The smell of leather mixed with sweat becomes part of daily life, clinging to your feet and the rush-covered floors. For women, dressing is no easier. A Tudor woman wears layers, a linen shift as a base, then stays or laces to shape the body, then a kirtle, and finally a gown or overdress. The shift alone is rough, but once laced into the stays, breathing becomes restricted and movement stiff. The idea is not comfort, but conformity, a body shaped according to the ideals of modesty and propriety. The woolen gown on top is heavy, the skirts long and easily dirted by mud in the streets. Over time, these garments gain stains, wear, and odors that are difficult to remove, since laundering is rare and often only partial. A woman might change her outer clothing only a handful of times a year. Now imagine you are not poor, but wealthy. Dressing becomes a performance, but not one of ease. Nobles follow strict sumptuary laws, regulations dictating who can wear what fabrics, colors, and styles. Bright silks, velvet, and fine linen are reserved for the upper classes. Colors like purple and deep crimson are symbols of power, often restricted to royalty. To disobey these laws is not simply to break fashion etiquette, but to risk punishment. Clothes mark you as belonging to a station, and the wrong garment could bring suspicion, or even noble fashion are notorious. Picture a ruff, that stiff, starched collar of linen, pleated into dozens of folds, stretching outward from the neck. It looks grand, it announces wealth, but it is also restrictive. It chafes the skin, itches at the neck, and makes turning your head awkward. The starch used to stiffen it leaves behind a smell, and maintaining it requires endless work by servants. Yet once dressed, you are trapped in this stiff halo of fabric for the day, your movements dictated by the demands of fashion. For noble women, the gowns are masterpieces of embroidery, brocade, and velvet, but also cages of fabric. Layers upon layers weigh down the body, with whalebone stiffening to maintain shape. The farthingale, a hoop skirt, spreads the gown outward into a wide, bell-like shape. Beautiful to the eye, but cumbersome to move in. Sitting is awkward, walking through narrow spaces nearly impossible, and the sheer weight of fabric strains the body. The beauty of Tudor fashion comes at the cost of constant physical burden. Hygiene worsens these discomforts. Clothes are rarely washed. Linen shifts might be changed more frequently, but outer garments, especially among the wealthy, are often cleaned only by brushing or airing out. Perfumes, herbs, or lavender sachets are used to mask odors, but the smells of sweat, smoke, and human closeness remain. Lice infest the seams, burrowing into fabric, biting the skin beneath. Combing and nitpicking become part of life, but there is no real escape from them. Everyone, rich or poor, carries these unwelcome highlights how deeply unequal Tudor society is. For the laborer, clothes are patched again and again until they can no longer be worn. For the noble, clothes are extravagant displays, worn once or twice before being stored away, never to be touched by sweat or toil. And yet, in both cases, the wearer suffers discomfort. The poor itch and scratch in rough wool, while the wealthy shift stiffly under the crushing weight of velvet and starch. Fashion is not freedom. It is a system of control, of discomfort worn proudly or endured silently. Even accessories bring burden. Men's codpieces, padded and exaggerated, draw attention but add bulk and awkwardness. Hats, almost always worn outdoors, are not simply for warmth but for signaling rank. Gloves are perfumed and embroidered, but stiff and impractical. Jewelry, while dazzling, is heavy, pulling on ears, weighing down necks, pinching fingers. Each item is a statement, but none are made for ease. And so, As you finish dressing for the Tudor day, you realize that comfort is never part of the equation. You are not dressing to feel good in your clothes. You are dressing to survive, to conform, to signal your place in a rigid society. Each layer is either too rough, too heavy, or too restrictive. Each seam hides lice. Each fold carries dirt. Fashion in Tudor Britain is a burden shared by all, whether you are a laborer in scratchy wool or a noble stiffened into a ruff. When you finally step out into the morning air, your body already aches. Your skin is irritated, your movements restricted, and your breath held tight under the pressure of laces and stays. What modern people consider an expression of individuality, Tudors endure as a mark of survival and submission. The clothes on your back are not freedom. They are another reminder of why you would never last long on your rough woolen clothes and taken your meager breakfast of bread and ale. The Tudor day truly begins. For the majority of people, the peasants, laborers, apprentices, and servants, this means one thing above all else: work. In Tudor Britain, work is not a pursuit of fulfillment or ambition, but the very core of survival. Without it, you and your family would have nothing. And yet, the nature of that work is relentless, exhausting, and often brutally unfair. If you are a farmer, as most people were, the day begins before the sun has even risen. You step out of your smoky home into the cold air of dawn, where the land stretches before you. Tools are simple: wooden plows, handheld scythes, and rakes. Iron is costly, and much of your equipment is crude, handed down or patched together over years of use. You bend to the soil, whether to sow, weed, or harvest, depending on the season. Each action is repetitive, and each season carries its own burdens. In spring, endless planting. In summer, the back-breaking work of tending. In autumn, the frantic rush of harvest before the weather turns. And in winter, the weary maintenance of tools, animals, and whatever food you manage to store. There are no breaks, no holidays beyond the strict rhythm of church festivals, and even then, the land does not wait for celebration. But it is also precarious. A poor harvest means hunger, not just for you, but for your entire village. Bad weather, floods, or droughts can ruin crops, and there is no safety net. The fear of famine is ever present. To wake each morning and bend your back over the soil is to carry that worry silently, knowing your survival depends on forces beyond your control. If you live in a town, your struggles take a different form. Perhaps you are an apprentice in a trade, a blacksmith's boy, a tailor's assistant, or a carpenter's helper. Apprenticeship is not easy. You live under the roof of your master, bound by strict rules, often working from before sunrise until after dark. The labor is hard, the pay minimal, and your independence non-existent. Years of service are required before you might become a journeyman, and even then, your path to becoming a master yourself is steep and uncertain. To displease your master could mean beatings, dismissal, or disgrace, leaving you with nothing. Servants fare no better. In the households of the wealthy, servants toil invisibly, rising before their employers to tend fires, prepare food, fetch water, and clean. They sleep in cramped quarters, often on the floor or in hallways, and eat the scraps of their master's meals. Life as a servant is one of constant obedience, with punishments for mistakes and little reward beyond a meager wage. And yet, many accept this life because it offers some stability, food, shelter, and the small protection of belonging to Work is unending and rarely recognized. A peasant woman rises with her husband, shares the toil of the fields, tends the animals, fetches water from the well, bakes bread, brews ale, spins wool, sews clothing, and raises children. Her labor is not paid in wages, but it is essential to survival. Even in towns, women are bound to endless domestic tasks, often taking in washing or spinning to earn a little extra coin. Their hands are never still, their backs never free of burden. And if a woman is widowed or alone, the struggle doubles. She must take on both the work of the field and the household, all while facing suspicion from neighbors in a society that distrusts independent women. The poor laws of Tudor England remind you of how fragile survival truly is. If you are unable to work, whether from age, injury, or misfortune, you risk falling into destitution. The state does little to protect you. Beggars fill the streets of towns, some branded as vagrants, others whipped or even hanged for the crime of having nothing. To lose your ability to work is to lose your right to exist in Tudor society. Even for those who manage to keep working, the rewards are meager. Wages for laborers are low, often barely enough to cover food and rent. Much of your harvest or earnings is owed to your landlord, the church, or taxes demanded by the crown. The sweat of your brow fills not your own larder, but the coffers of those above you. The sense of injustice is ever present, but powerless to change. Work is not freedom. It is bondage to the hierarchy of physical toll. Without modern medicine, every strain, every injury, every cut carries danger. A blister from a tool might become infected. A broken bone could mean permanent disability. Work wears down the body quickly. Many laborers are old before their time, their faces lined, their backs stooped, their teeth worn away by coarse bread. To survive into middle age is already an achievement. To keep working into old age is a necessity, not a choice. Despite the hardship, Tudor people endure with resilience. Communities share labor during harvest, neighbors help one another in times of need, and festivals provide brief moments of relief. But beneath the surface lies the grinding truth. Work consumes every day, every season, every life. There is no retirement, no rest, no escape. From the moment you wake in your smoky home to the moment you collapse back into your straw bed, work defines you. So, as you bend once again to the soil or hammer the iron on the anvil, you realize that there is no comfort in Tudor labor. There is only survival, hard, unforgiving, and unending. And this relentless struggle, woven into every Tudor day, reminds you yet again why you would never truly last Tudor England. It might be tempting to think that while the poor and the peasants suffered through endless toil, The nobles and wealthy classes enjoyed lives of leisure, luxury, and ease. At first glance, their grand houses, elaborate clothing, and fine banquets seem to suggest as much. But step inside the life of a Tudor noble, and you quickly discover that wealth comes with its own crushing burdens. Comfort is never guaranteed, and survival at the top of society is as precarious as it is at the bottom, only in different ways. The noble day begins with ceremony, not rest. In a great household, waking up is rarely private. Servants arrive early to prepare your chambers, stoke fires, bring water for washing, and lay out your heavy, elaborate clothing. Unlike the simple wool tunics of peasants, your garments are layered and restrictive. Stiffened collars, doublets, farthingales, and heavy gowns encase your body, weighing you down and limiting your movement. Dressing is not a matter of pulling on clothes, but a lengthy ritual requiring assistance. Every choice of fabric and color is dictated by sumptuary laws, which control who may wear what. Laws that remind you daily that your identity is bound not by freedom, but by rigid hierarchy. Once dressed, your responsibilities begin. As a noble, you do not have the option of quietly tending a field or mending tools in solitude. Instead, your life is lived under constant scrutiny. Your household must be managed, your tenants supervised, your lands accounted for. Nobility is not just privilege, it is duty. Failing in those duties could mean loss of reputation, wealth, or influence. And in Tudor society, at court, reputation pressure multiplies. If you are in the orbit of the king or queen, every glance, every word, every gesture could determine your fortune. Court life is dazzling but dangerous. Banquets are filled with intrigue. Dances conceal whispered alliances, and flattery often decides more than merit. The monarch's favor is everything. Without it, titles, lands, and lives can be stripped away in an instant. One wrong word, one careless look, and you could find yourself accused of treason or heresy. Charges that, in Tudor times, almost always ended on the executioner's block. To live as a noble is to live in constant performance, a dance of appearances that never ends. Even at home, the pressure of rank is immense. Your estate is not simply a house, but a stage, meant to display your wealth and power. Guests must be fed lavishly, entertained properly, and treated with the utmost courtesy. This requires endless planning, spending, and the tireless work of dozens of servants. Yet it is you, as lord or lady, who must take responsibility if anything is amiss. A poorly served meal, a mismanaged guest, or a rumor of miserliness could stain your reputation. Nobility is as much about appearances as it is about land, and maintaining those appearances consumes your days. And though your food is richer than that of a peasant, it does not necessarily make you healthier. Tudor nobles dine on vast amounts of roasted meats, pies, and heavy sauces. Vegetables are often dismissed as food for the poor, leaving diets unbalanced. Too much red meat, too much sugar, and too much wine leave many nobles with gout, rotting teeth, and digestive troubles. Medical care, though more accessible to the rich, is still primitive and often dangerous. Bloodletting, purging, and bizarre herbal concoctions are common, sometimes doing more harm than good. Wealth may buy a physician, but it cannot buy genuine health. The burdens are especially heavy. Their lives are defined by alliances, marriages, and childbearing. A noble woman's duty is to produce heirs, to secure her family's lineage, and to strengthen political ties through marriage. Childbirth in Tudor England is fraught with danger, even for the wealthy. Many women die young in labor or from infections afterward. Those who survive face the endless cycle of pregnancy and motherhood, their bodies worn by the demands of family and politics alike. And beyond the household, noble women at court live in an atmosphere of constant competition, where beauty, charm, and influence must be carefully maintained to secure their family standing. Even children of noble families live under weighty expectations. From an early age, they are trained in courtly manners, languages, music, and diplomacy. Their marriages are not a matter of choice, but of arrangement, tools in the chess game of noble alliances. Sons are pushed toward military or political careers, daughters groomed for advantageous unions. Childhood is not carefree. It is a preparation for a life of duty, strategy, and responsibility. Then there is the ever-present shadow of politics and religion. In Tudor England, the shifting tides of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation meant that allegiance to the wrong faith could end careers or lives. Nobles had to navigate these dangerous waters carefully, swearing loyalty to the monarch's chosen church, even if it meant abandoning personal beliefs. Those who hesitated or who found themselves on the wrong side of a regime change often faced imprisonment, confiscation of lands, or execution. To be a noble in Tudor times was to walk a tightrope where one misstep could take place within houses that, though grand, are far from comfortable. Great halls are drafty, rooms smoky from fires, and corridors cold in winter. Privacy is rare, as servants are always nearby, and the size of the estate means constant movement up and down stone staircases. Even in their grandeur, Tudor noble homes lacked the comforts we take for granted today: heating, plumbing, or quiet solitude. So, while peasants bent their backs over the soil, nobles bent their lives beneath the crushing weight of expectation. If poverty brought hunger, wealth brought fear. If the working class suffered from physical exhaustion, the nobility endured the exhaustion of constant vigilance. To be noble in Tudor England was not to live freely, but to live trapped in a gilded cage, where every word and action was watched, weighed, and judged. In the end, the struggles of nobles and peasants alike remind you that no station in Tudor society was truly easy. Life at the bottom meant endless toil. Life at the top meant endless pressure. And whichever place you might imagine yourself in, you would find it far harder to endure that a modern person would find most unbearable about life in Tudor Britain. It is hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. Imagine for a moment trying to live without soap, without showers, without running water, and without any of the small comforts you take for granted every single day. In Tudor times, the very idea of cleanliness was different from how we understand it now, where you might equate being clean with bathing regularly, brushing your teeth, washing your hands with soap, and wearing freshly laundered clothes. A Tudor person saw cleanliness more as an outward appearance, something you could fake with perfumes, powders, and clean collars. Behind the carefully arranged hair and the elegant ruffs, there was often a body that hadn't been washed in weeks or even months. To step into a Tudor household, or worse, a crowded Tudor street, was to be met with a wall of smells: smoke, sweat, unwashed flesh, animals, and the sour tang of waste lingering everywhere. Bathing, at least the kind where you submerge yourself in water to scrub your body, was rare in Tudor England. Medieval bathhouses, once common in towns and cities, had fallen out of favor by this period. Some were closed by authorities who associated them with disease, while others gained reputations as places of vice and immorality. By the reign of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the bathhouse had virtually disappeared. Instead, people relied on what they called dry washing. They might wipe their faces and hands with a damp cloth, rub themselves down with linen, or use herbs and vinegar to freshen up. Nobles often believed that immersing the body in water opened the pores, letting disease in. Thus, to protect themselves, they avoided baths altogether. You might splash your face with rose water, comb through your hair with a scented oil, and dust your body with powders to mask the smell. But the underlying odor never really went away. Played a strange role in Tudor hygiene. For the poor, clothing was seldom washed because washing garments was labor-intensive and expensive. Instead, clothes were worn until they were visibly soiled, often crawling with lice or fleas. For the wealthy, the trick was to change shirts and undergarments frequently, believing that the fresh linen would draw out impurities from the skin. Of course, the shirts themselves were rarely scrubbed with anything we would call proper soap. They might be rinsed in water or beaten clean, but stains and smells lingered. The practice of constantly swapping clean linen gave nobles a surface appearance of cleanliness, while the truth of their bodies remained otherwise. For someone from the modern world, who is used to the scent of laundry detergent and freshly washed fabrics, simply being near a Tudor noble might have been a pungent shock. Mouths were no better. There was no toothpaste in Tudor Britain, nor was there much understanding of dental care. People tried to clean their teeth with rough cloths or sticks rubbed with salt and herbs. But sugar had become more widely available thanks to imports from overseas, and it wreaked havoc on the teeth of the wealthy. Henry VIII himself suffered from foul-smelling breath and rotting teeth, a condition not uncommon among nobles of his time. Imagine sharing a meal with a courtier who has not brushed properly in years, whose mouth carries the smell of decay mixed with spices, ale, and meat. It would not be pleasant company. Suffered because of the conditions of Tudor homes and streets. In towns and cities, refuse and waste piled up everywhere. Chamber pots were emptied into ditches or directly into the street, where the contents mingled with animal dung and household trash. In summer, the stench would hang in the air, clinging to clothes, walls, and people. Flies and rats thrived in this filth, carrying disease from one house to another. Even rural cottages were not much better. While there might be less crowding, smoke from the hearth coated the walls and lungs, and washing water was often dirty, drawn from ponds or streams polluted by animals. Here was another battlefield. Head lice were constant companions for both the rich and the poor. People combed their hair with fine-toothed combs, but these were rarely effective in removing all the insects. Some used vinegar rinses or herbal remedies, but infestations persisted. Beards and wigs added another layer of discomfort, often harboring lice or becoming matted with sweat. Wealthier women powdered their faces and wore elaborate head coverings to project refinement, but beneath the layers of fabric, sweat and grime collected. For the poor, who could not afford wigs, powders, or elaborate veils, greasy hair and visible lice were part of daily life. Hands, which we now wash instinctively before meals, were often filthy in Tudor Britain. There was no widespread use of soap, and hand washing was minimal. At the dinner table, people shared trenchers, flat slabs of bread or wooden boards, using their hands to tear meat, dip into sauces, and scoop food. Servants sometimes brought basins of water for hand rinsing before meals, but this was not universal. Imagine sitting at a meal where the person next to you, having worked in the fields or handled animals, now digs into the same dish you are about to eat from, their hands unwashed since morning. It was a communal way of life, but one that would likely revolt. The smells of the body were thought of differently in the Tudor world. Where we might recoil from the scent of sweat, in Tudor England it was simply accepted as part of life. The reek of unwashed bodies was so universal that people barely noticed it. Instead, odors were covered with perfumes, herbs, and flowers. Nobles carried pomanders, small balls filled with fragrant spices or oils, hung from belts or worn on chains, which they held to their noses when the smells became overwhelming. But even this was a temporary solution, unable to truly mask the stench of Tudor streets, homes, and bodies. The result was a society where hygiene, as we know it, was virtually non-existent. Disease spread easily, wounds became infected, and parasites thrived. To live in Tudor Britain was to live in constant contact with dirt, waste, and smell. And yet, the people themselves did not think of their lives as unclean. To them, this was simply the natural order of things. The sweat on your brow was proof of your labor. The grime beneath your fingernails showed your work. The smell of smoke and food on your clothes told of your household's survival. Cleanliness was not about removing filth, but about maintaining appearances, fresh linen, a powdered face, a whiff of rose water, or a sprig of herbs tucked into your sleeve. For someone transported from the modern world into Tudor Britain, however, the sensory shock would be overwhelming. To wake each day in a smoky room, to dress in lice-ridden garments, to eat with dirty hands beside neighbors who had not bathed in months, to walk through streets rank with waste and animals. and to end the day crawling into a bed shared with fleas. Such a life would feel unbearable. Hygiene, or rather the lack of it, would be one of the hardest challenges to endure in a single child in Tudor Britain. Your life would begin under a cloud of uncertainty. From the very first breath, the odds were stacked against you. Infant mortality was painfully high, and many children did not survive their first year. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and the dreaded plague claimed countless young lives. Even before an illness struck, malnutrition often weakened infants, especially during times of poor harvests when mothers could not provide enough nourishment. To be born in Tudor England was to be born into risk, where survival was an achievement in itself. Those who survived infancy quickly discovered that childhood was not the carefree period it often is today. For most Tudor families, children were not shielded from adult responsibilities. By the age of 6 or 7, you would already be expected to contribute to your household. If you were born into a farming family, which was the fate of the vast majority, your small hands would be put to work in the fields, tending livestock, or assisting with planting and harvesting. There was no question of whether you were ready. Your labor was needed, and every pair of hands mattered. Play was a luxury that came only in rare stolen moments. Education was limited and depended heavily on your family status. Noble children might have tutors or be sent to grammar schools, where they would learn Latin, religion, and the art of rhetoric. Boys from wealthier merchant families might also receive an education, preparing them for trades, law, or service at court. But for most children, particularly girls and peasants, education was a dream out of reach. Instead, you would learn skills at home: how to bake bread, spin wool, tend a garden, or prepare food. Literacy was not seen as essential for the poor; survival skills were. And for girls, expectations were stricter still. You were being trained for marriage from a young age, your worth tied to household skills rather than knowledge. By the time you were 10 or 12, your family might arrange for you to become an apprentice. Apprenticeships were long and demanding, often lasting 7 years or more. You would leave your family behind, moving into the household of a master craftsman, where you would learn a trade such as blacksmithing, tailoring, or carpentry. This was both an opportunity and a hardship. The work was grueling, the hours long, and discipline could be harsh. Your master effectively became your parent during those years, with authority over your every action. Many apprentices were treated fairly, but others were exploited, worked to exhaustion, or punished severely. For noble children, life was no gentler in its own way. From an early age, boys were prepared for military service or positions at court, while girls were groomed to make advantageous marriages that would strengthen their family's political or economic ties. A noble girl might be sent at a very young age to live in another household, often that of a higher-ranking noble, to be educated in manners, music, and courtly behavior. Her childhood was not her own. It was a training ground for the role she would be expected to play in her family's ambitions. Illness was a constant shadow for children across all classes. A simple fever could prove fatal, and injuries often led to infections that medicine of the time was ill-equipped to treat. The sweating sickness, which swept through England in terrifying waves, claimed many young lives within hours of the first symptoms. Childhood was fragile, uncertain, and short. It was not uncommon for parents to lose several children to illness before one or two survived into adulthood. This ever-present loss shaped family life, making it at once tender and hardened. Parents loved their children, but they knew not to count too heavily on their survival. Discipline were also central to a Tudor child's world. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not just a saying, it was a belief. Both at home and in school, physical discipline was expected. A boy who misbehaved at grammar school might be beaten with a birch rod. At home, disobedience was met with the strap or the stick. Discipline was thought to shape obedience and morality, preparing children for the harsh realities of adulthood. Affection existed, but it was often tempered by the stern demands of survival and order. Yet, amid the hardship, children still found moments of joy. Simple games like hoop rolling, blind man's bluff, or singing songs around a fire were cherished escapes. Children might fashion toys from scraps of wood, play with pebbles or dolls made from rags, and enjoy festivals when the strict rhythm of work temporarily loosened. In villages, children would gather to dance on holidays or follow along during May Day celebrations, their laughter filling the air, even if only briefly. Girls, in particular, bore heavy burdens. From a young age, they were trained in domestic work, sewing, spinning, brewing ale, tending gardens, and raising younger siblings. By the time they were teenagers, they were often married off, sometimes to men much older than themselves. Childbirth came early, and with it, the terrifying risks of maternal mortality. For a Tudor girl, childhood often ended before she had played a strong role in shaping children's lives. From their earliest years, they were taught prayers, catechisms, and hymns. Religious festivals marked the calendar, and moral instruction was woven into every aspect of life. Children were seen not just as future adults, but as souls needing guidance and discipline to walk the path of righteousness. Their innocence was considered fleeting, and their lives were tightly bound by the expectations of faith and obedience. To modern ears, the life of a Tudor child sounds unbearably grim. There were no protections, no real rights, and few opportunities for joy. Childhood was not celebrated as a special, protected stage of life, but rather as a brief and demanding prelude to adulthood. You were not expected to be carefree. You were expected to be useful, obedient, and ready to serve your family and community. And yet, children persevered. They laughed, played, and found comfort in family bonds, even within the harshness of their world. They adapted to lives of labor, illness, and discipline, surviving as best they could in a society that left little room for softness. For us today, it is difficult to imagine a childhood stripped of the freedom and protection we now consider essential. But in Tudor Britain, this was the norm. A child's life was short, uncertain, and burdened with responsibility. A stark reminder of how much has changed in our understanding of what it down for a meal in Tudor Britain. You might expect comfort, nourishment, and perhaps a small respite from the difficulties of the day. Yet, for most people of this era, food itself was not a source of safety or delight. It was a gamble, a matter of survival fraught with danger. The idea of food being reliably safe and regulated, the way we think of it today, simply did not exist. In Tudor times, every bite carried the risk of illness, malnutrition, or outright poisoning. What seems unthinkable to us now was an everyday reality for men, women, and children living under the reigns of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. Let us begin with something as basic as bread, the staple of the Tudor diet. For the poor, it was often made from rye, barley, or oats, baked in small village ovens or even within the hearths of their cottages. On the surface, this seems wholesome enough, but the truth is more unsettling. Rye bread, especially in damp seasons, was susceptible to ergot, a toxic fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and even death. Entire villages could be struck down by outbreaks of ergot poisoning, a slow, creeping misery often misinterpreted as divine punishment or witchcraft. For peasants, however, there was little choice. Bread was life, and to refuse it was to starve. Even wheat bread, reserved for the wealthy, was not always pure. Bakers were notorious for stretching their flour with fillers, chalk, sand, or even ground bones. These additions made loaves heavier, allowing them to fetch a higher price at the market. But they also scraped away at teeth and damaged the stomach. In London, laws were occasionally passed against adulterating bread, but enforcement was weak, and desperate bakers found ways to cut corners. Imagine biting into what looks like a golden loaf, only to discover grit grinding between your teeth and an aftertaste that leaves your gut great risk, though it was also one of the most sought-after foods in Tudor society. For the wealthy, a banquet table might groan beneath roasted swans, venison, beef, or boar, while the common folk made do with small amounts of salted pork or tough cuts of mutton. But refrigeration was non-existent, and meat spoiled quickly. To disguise the rot, cooks would drench it in heavy spices, vinegar, or ale. To modern ears, the descriptions of Tudor feasts often sound rich and decadent, but in reality, those heavily seasoned sauces were not for flavor alone. They were a cloak for decay. Eating spoiled meat could cause violent food poisoning, and while the wealthiest might recover, poorer folk, already weakened by hard labor, might not survive. Fish, too, was a cornerstone of the Tudor diet, especially because of religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. But fish was often salted, dried, or pickled to keep it edible for long journeys from the coast to inland towns. By the time it reached the table, it was often so salty or so rank that it required elaborate cooking to make it palatable. The smell alone could turn the stomach, but hunger drove people to consume it anyway. The danger was compounded by the filthy rivers in which many fish were caught. Rivers like the Thames, which doubled as both a fishery and an open sewer. The thought of eating fish from such waters today would make most people ill before the first bite. Dairy carried its own hazards. Milk soured quickly, and cheese, though it lasted longer, was not always made under sanitary conditions. In fact, fresh milk was often reserved for the very young or the very sick, while adults consumed it curdled or in the form of butter. Yet even butter was prone to contamination from dirty churns or spoiled cream. For Tudor peasants, a bad batch of butter was more than an inconvenience. It could mean an outbreak of stomach illness in the entire household. Granaries, pantries, and kitchens were alive with rats, mice, and insects, which easily found their way into sacks of grain and barrels of flour. It was not unusual to discover weevils in bread or maggots in cheese. Instead of throwing these out, most families simply cut away the worst parts or consumed them regardless. Food waste was unthinkable when survival was at stake. For the Tudor poor, a weevil in your bread was simply part of the meal. The danger did not end with food that was spoiled or infested. There were also the risks of outright famine. Tudor England was an agricultural society, and a bad harvest meant hunger for thousands. Grain prices could soar after a poor season, leaving entire villages unable to afford bread. In these times, desperation drove people to forage for anything edible: acorns, roots, even grass. Starvation, especially in the countryside, was an ever-present specter. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Children bore the brunt of it, their growth stunted and their survival uncertain. For the wealthy, the dangers were different, but no less real. A nobleman's table was laden with exotic imports: sugar from the Mediterranean, wine from France, spices from the East. These luxuries were often stored for months, sometimes years, in damp Tudor manors, where mold and contamination crept in unnoticed. Sugar, which was ground by hand, was so coarse that it ground down teeth into painful stumps. The rich suffered not from lack of food, but from overindulgence. Gout, a painful swelling of the joints, was so common among noblemen that it was nicknamed the rich man's disease. Their feasts, while impressive in appearance, were far the most basic necessity, could not be trusted. Wells were easily contaminated by human and animal waste, while rivers and streams doubled as sewers. This is why ale, weekly brewed and drunk in enormous quantities, became the default drink for all classes, including children. It was not entirely safe, but safer than water. Imagine a Tudor child waking in the morning and sipping from a mug of thin ale instead of milk or juice. For us, the thought is jarring. For them, it was simply life. Altogether, food in Tudor England was not the comfort we imagine today. It was a constant negotiation with risk, a daily question of whether the meal on the table would nourish or destroy. The poor risked starvation, the wealthy risked disease from excess, and all lived with the ever-present chance of poisoning from what they consumed. In Tudor Britain, sitting down to eat was not a guarantee of safety. It was a reminder of how fragile survival itself was. Terrifying in Tudor Britain. The so-called cures might seem even worse. For medicine in the 16th century was not grounded in science as we know it today, but in a mixture of superstition, trial and error, ancient theories, and sometimes pure desperation. Imagine yourself falling ill in Tudor England. Perhaps you've caught a fever, or a deep cut has turned red and swollen. The natural response would be to call for a physician, or if you couldn't afford one, a barber surgeon or a wise woman from the village. Yet what awaited you was rarely healing, and often a treatment that was painful, risky, and at times deadly. The horrors of Tudor medicine weren't hidden, they were a daily reality. One of the most common medical practices was bloodletting, a method inherited from medieval times and rooted in the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. These humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were believed to govern health, and any imbalance would lead to sickness. The solution? Remove excess blood by cutting into a vein, using a leech, or even applying heated cups to the skin to draw it out. So if you had a fever, the physician might calmly assure you that bloodletting would balance your system. Of course, in reality, this often left patients weaker, more vulnerable to infection, and sometimes dead. Imagine lying in a dim Tudor chamber as a barber surgeon slices into your arm, the warm trickle of blood filling a bowl, while neighbors watch with hushed awe, believing you are being healed rather than slowly was only the beginning. Tudor cures range from the bizarre to the revolting. If you had a sore throat, you might be told to gargle with vinegar mixed with salt and herbs. Or worse, swallow concoctions made of crushed earthworms or powdered toads. Toothache? Some believe that driving a nail into a wooden beam while reciting prayers would transfer the pain into the wood. If your stomach hurt, you might be given potions laced with mercury or antimony. Substances we know today are poisonous. Yet in a world without antibiotics, vaccines, or even basic sanitation, people clung to any remedy that promised hope, no matter how strange. Then there were the plague doctors. During outbreaks of the bubonic plague, physicians would sometimes wear long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, thought to filter out the miasma or bad air that spread disease. For the average Tudor person, the sight of one of these masked figures shuffling through the street was terrifying. The cure they offered often involved cutting open buboes, the painful swellings caused by plague, and applying poultices of onions, butter, or even dried human excrement. The stench, the pain, and the fear would have been overwhelming, yet desperate families allowed it, clinging to even the slimmest chance of survival. It wasn't just plague that brought horrors. Everyday injuries could be equally dangerous. Imagine you're a Tudor laborer who cuts his hand while chopping wood. A deep wound today might be cleaned and stitched in a sterile environment. In Tudor times, however, the barber surgeon might pour boiling oil into the wound to cauterize it, or pack it with moss and cobwebs thought to stop the bleeding. Infection was almost inevitable, and without understanding germs, the healers could do little to stop it once it set in. Amputation was often the only option, carried out without anesthetic, just a quick slice with a saw and the patient screaming into a rag, sometimes fainting from shock. Better. Noble households employed physicians trained at universities, but their knowledge was still bound to the four humors and astrological charts. A lady of the court suffering from migraines might be told her stars were misaligned, and the cure could involve drinking potions made of ground pearls, gold leaf, or even powdered mummy imported from the East. Yes, real human remains were sold as medicine, believed to carry life force into the body of the sick. These treatments were staggeringly expensive, yet no more effective than the charms of a village healer. Folk remedies were another layer of Tudor medicine, passed down through generations. A mother might tie an amulet around her child's neck to ward off fever, or a wise woman might brew teas from nettles and dandelions to ease stomach pains. While some herbal remedies had genuine healing properties, they were mixed with a heavy dose of magic and superstition. A wart, for instance, might be cured by rubbing it with a piece of bacon and burying the meat in the ground. When the bacon rotted, the wart was supposed to vanish. To the Tudors, there was no clear line between medicine and magic. Both were woven into the same tapestry of survival. Surgery was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Tudor medicine. Performed by barber surgeons who also cut hair and pulled teeth, operations were crude, bloody, and unimaginably painful. Without anesthesia, patients were held down by assistants as knives or saws cut into flesh. Speed was the surgeon's best skill. The quicker the operation, the more chance the patient might survive shock. Instruments were rarely cleaned between patients. An infection killed more people than the wounds themselves. Even setting a broken bone could be an ordeal, with wooden splints tied tight and no pain relief beyond strong ale or a bite of leather. Was fraught with danger. Tudor women faced a lifetime risk of death in childbirth, not because of the act itself, but because of infection and lack of safe practices. Midwives relied on prayers, charms, and herbal tonics, and while their experience often saved lives, they were powerless against complications. A difficult birth might lead to both mother and child perishing, and in times of plague or sweating sickness, pregnant women were especially vulnerable. Looking back, it is easy to feel horror at the thought of Tudor medicine. The cures sound more like tortures, the treatments more like punishments. Yet for the Tudors themselves, these practices were not barbaric but hopeful. To them, illness was often seen as divine punishment or the result of bad air, bad luck, or an imbalance in nature. Medicine was as much about restoring spiritual harmony as healing the body. Even as they endured the pain of bloodletting or swallowed foul potions, they believed they were fighting for their lives in the only way they knew. So, if you were unlucky enough to fall ill in Tudor Britain, your survival depended less on the skill of your doctor and more on sheer chance. You might recover despite the cure, not because of it. And even the wealthiest courtier with access to the finest physicians could die from an infection that today would be treated with a simple course of antibiotics. For the Tudors, medicine was a gamble, a mixture of faith, tradition, and experimentation. To us, it looks like a nightmare, but to them, it was the only light in the dark halls. Imagine walking through Tudor London, Perhaps you think of grand palaces, bustling marketplaces, or the iconic timbered houses with their whitewashed walls and black wooden beams. Yet the reality beneath that romantic image is far less pleasant. The streets of London in the 16th century were narrow, overcrowded, and most of all, astonishingly filthy. Imagine yourself stepping outside your wooden home, perhaps one of the many crammed together along a crooked lane. Almost immediately, the stench would overwhelm you. There were no proper sewers, no underground drainage to whisk away the waste of thousands of people. Instead, refuse from households was simply thrown into the street where it piled up in the gutters. Human waste from chamber pots was often hurled from upstairs windows, sometimes with a casual shout of warning, sometimes not at all. Horse dung littered the paths, mixing with mud and straw to form a foul, slippery sludge that was impossible to avoid. It clung to your shoes, soaked your hemline, and followed you everywhere. As you made your way further into the heart of the city, the sights would be as unpleasant as the smells. The butchers who worked near Smithfield and Eastcheap dumped the blood and offal of slaughtered animals directly into the street, where it congealed and attracted swarms of flies. Dogs roamed freely, snapping up scraps, while pigs, kept in the city despite repeated bans, snuffled around in the mess. The River Thames, which you might hope would offer some relief, was little better. Tanneries, brewers, and dyers poured their chemical-laden waste into the waters, while countless latrines and open drains emptied directly into the current. Drinking from the river was unthinkable, though many still did, and water carriers who brought buckets of river water around for a fee helped spread disease from one household made matters even worse. Tudor London was growing rapidly, as people from the countryside flocked to the city in search of work and opportunity. Houses were built so close together that the upper stories almost touched, blocking out much of the light. In the cramped, twisting alleyways, air circulation was poor, and the smell of rot, smoke, and sewage lingered endlessly. With so many people crammed into such tight quarters, and with sanitation so poor, the city became a breeding ground for plague and other infectious diseases. Rats scurried along the gutters, fleas spread silently from one host to another, and outbreaks of illness swept through the population with terrifying regularity. A walk through London was not simply unpleasant, it was dangerous. Merchants and tradesmen carried out their business amid this filth, setting up stalls in crowded streets and markets. Imagine buying a loaf of bread or a piece of fish while just a few feet away, an open ditch carried a trickle of sewage downhill. Food was exposed to flies, dust, and the grime of passing traffic, yet it was sold and eaten without hesitation. There were attempts at regulation. City authorities occasionally organized cleanup efforts, and laws were passed to prevent butchers or tanners from dumping their waste in certain areas, but enforcement was patchy. Wealthier citizens might pay to have their street frontage swept or their rubbish carted away. But for the vast majority, the mess was simply part of added to the chaos. Streets echoed with the shouts of vendors selling pies, fish, or trinkets, the cries of children playing in a muck, and the constant clip-clop of horses pulling carts loaded with goods. These carts churned up the already filthy roads, splattering passers-by with whatever slurry had accumulated there. If you were unlucky enough to be caught in the rain, the situation grew worse. Water mixed with dung and refused into a foul-brown soup that flooded doorways and soaked clothing. The narrow streets, often unpaved, turned into rivers of filth and without modern drainage. The muck simply lingered until it dried into a layer of dirt that would soon be stirred back into the air. And yet, amid this squalor, life thrived. People continued with their routines, seemingly accustomed to the smells and sights that would make a modern visitor recoil. Children splashed in puddles, apprentices shouted to one another across alleys, and street performers gathered crowds in squares that reeked of waste. For them, the filth was not an anomaly, but the normal backdrop of urban existence. The city's population continued to grow despite the dangers, driven by opportunity and ambition. In the Tudor mind, the dirt and the risk were simply part of the price one paid for living in the kingdom's greatest city. The dangers of the streets only increased. Without proper lighting, the twisting lanes became shadowy and perilous. Thieves and cutpurses lurked in the dark, and stumbling into an open ditch or cesspit was a constant risk. The air was heavy with the smell of waste, mingled now with smoke from 1,000 hearths. In some neighborhoods, watchmen patrolled with lanterns and halberds, but their presence did little to clean the streets or dispel the pervasive sense of danger. To walk through Tudor London after dark was to move through a world of shadows, filth, and unease, where every step threatened to fall into muck or an encounter with disease. In truth, the filth of Tudor London was not just a nuisance. It was one of the greatest threats to survival. The waste, the overcrowding, and the lack of sanitation created an environment where diseases flourished, where the plague could erupt without warning, and where simply walking through the streets was to risk one's health. To live here, even for a single day, was to endure conditions that most of us can scarcely imagine. Yet for the people of the time, it was life as they knew it, a daily reality that shaped their existence in the shadow of grandeur and monarchy. As night falls on Tudor Britain, our single day has come to an end. You've seen the smoke-filled houses, the bitter food, the endless labor, and the looming shadow of disease. You've walked the filthy streets, braved the dangers of travel, and glimpsed both the pleasures and brutalities of Tudor entertainment. What began with a restless, lice-filled waking has ended in darkness, with little safety to be found even in sleep. It is easy, from our modern world, to imagine that life back then was simpler or more charming. But when we step into their shoes, even for a single day, we begin to understand how difficult survival truly was. Every breath carried a risk. Every meal could bring sickness, and every night was filled with fear. So, as you close your eyes tonight, take comfort in the warmth, safety, and peace of the present. You are not in Tudor Britain. You are here now, safe and secure. Let that thought carry you gently into rest, far from the worries and hardships of the past. Sleep well and dream softly, for you have survived what few in Tudor times ever could, a single day